Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Do you remember the old days of traveling by coach, Granny? Yes, I do, said the old lady with a smile. One of the strangest things in my life happened during my first coach trip. I will tell you the story. As Horace Walpole says, I am getting into my anecdotage, she added, laughing. Granny knew her stories were always enjoyed. In my younger days, people didn't travel here, and they're like you girls do now, Granny said. Going on a coach trip was a big event. When I took my first trip, I was almost 20 years old. My father and mother thought a lot about whether I could travel alone on the stagecoach. My father was a country parson, as you know, and we lived in a small, quiet Yorkshire village. But my aunt, who was rich and had no children, had moved to York. She wrote and begged me to visit her for the winter to keep her company. Finally, my parents decided I could go. Back then, rich families often stayed in their own nearby towns for fun instead of traveling all the way to London. York, like many other towns, still has beautiful old houses where these families lived. The towns had lively parties and events. I think people were kinder and more social in those days than they are now in London. I was excited to leave my boring village life for the fun of York. But when it was time to say goodbye to my parents, I almost wished I wasn't going. I had never been away from them before. Farmer Gray, who was taking me to the next town to catch the coach, was very kind. He pretended not to notice that I was crying under my veil. We traveled down the narrow roads until we reached the little market town. There, I waited at the Blue Boar Inn to have tea and wait for the coach. I had seen the coach come and go many times before with my father, but it felt like a dream that I, Dolly Harcourt, was about to be a passenger. As the evening grew darker, I saw the mail coach's red lamps shining through the mist. The workers quickly changed the horses, and we passengers had to get in just as fast. My seat was booked days ago, so I climbed inside before I had time to think. The coach was empty when I got in because some passengers had just left. I was happy to have it to myself for the long night journey. But then, two people hurried up, a short man and a woman wearing a long cloak, a bonnet, and a thick veil. Just in time, said the man. I've booked 2 seats, Mr. Jones and Miss Jenny. They got in just as the horses began to move. I felt relieved that I wasn't alone with a strange man. I looked at the woman with the cloak and veil as she sat awkwardly in the corner across from me. Then I leaned forward to move my small bags off the seat. My hand accidentally touched her bonnet. I'm sorry, madam, I said politely. I was just moving these bags so they wouldn't bother you. Don't worry about Jenny, miss, said the man. He had a red face and looked rough. She'll be fine. Then he helped the woman into her seat, but not very kindly. Is she a sister or wife? I thought. He doesn't seem very polite to her. I didn't like him at all, but he didn't seem to care what I thought. He pulled a cap from his pocket, put it on, sat next to the woman, and was soon asleep. I knew this because he started snoring loudly. I couldn't sleep like him. I felt very lonely and nervous. The coach seemed to be going very fast. 10 miles an hour felt like a lot to me. Back then, there were no trains to go faster. I began thinking about all the scary stories I had heard about coach accidents and highwaymen. I imagined a highwayman riding up to the coach and pointing a gun through the window. I didn't have much for him to steal, but I didn't want to lose the silk purse my mother had made for me. Inside, my parents had placed a guinea each, a lot of money for us. What if the highwayman wanted more than money? What if he made me get out of the coach and dance with him on the moor, like Claude Duval did in stories? My nervous thoughts were interrupted when the woman in the cloak moved restlessly. The man woke up halfway, gave her a nudge with his elbow, and said sharply, "Keep quiet, I say." How strange, I thought. Why is he speaking to her like that? Could he be drunk? I shivered at the idea of being stuck in the coach for hours with this rude man. He didn't seem to care about the woman's comfort. The moon rose, and I could see them more clearly. The man's hand was under the woman's cloak, holding her wrist tightly. A new fear came to me. Was the woman a lunatic, and was this man her caretaker? I tried to see the woman's face, but her bonnet and thick veil hid it completely. Soon the man fell asleep again, snoring loudly, and I kept looking at the woman. I felt sorry for her. Was she a madwoman, taken away from her home by this rough man? I wondered if she was old or young, poor or rich. I made up many stories in my head about her. I felt so bad for her that I tried to talk to her. I said something polite, but she didn't reply. I touched her cloak gently to get her attention, but she quickly moved away. She made a sound like a growl, as if she were angry. Embarrassed, I sat back in my seat and decided not to speak to her again. I wanted the coach to reach her quickly so I could get away from these strange passengers. I was just a shy country girl, and this was my first trip away from home. It was scary to think I might be trapped with a drunk man and a madwoman. I sat very still, not wanting to upset the woman. But my earlier attempt to talk to her had disturbed her. She kept moving and muttering to herself. I slid to the far end of the seat to stay as far from her as possible. In doing so, my shawl fell to the floor. I leaned down to pick it up, and I saw something under her cloak. My heart stopped. It wasn't a woman's foot in a pretty shoe. It was a hairy paw with long nails. Was it cloven? My loud scream stopped the coach. The guard and the passengers outside quickly came to the door. For the first time in my life, I fainted, so I missed the first moments of the chaos. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the ground, surrounded by kind people. They were offering me things like smelling salts and brandy to help me feel better. In the background, I could hear the coachman and the guard shouting angrily at the man from inside the coach. They were very upset. I sat up slowly and looked around. The man, who now looked very embarrassed, stood quietly while the others scolded him. Beside him, with her cloak pulled back and her bonnet pushed to the side, was the lady. But she wasn't a lady at all. She was a performing bear. The man was a showman, and he had brought his bear, Miss Jenny, with him. He wanted to save money and avoid trouble, so he had bought tickets for himself and the bear. He had hoped that the cloak, bonnet, and darkness would hide the truth. The guard and coachman were furious when they discovered the trick. They shouted at the showman, threatening to punish him. The man apologized again and again. He even gave the coach staff more than just words to make them calm down. Finally, they let it go, and we got back on the road at full speed to make up for lost time. Even though the showman promised that Miss Jenny was as quiet as an angel, I refused to ride in the coach again. I didn't care how harmless the bear was. The coachman understood and let me sit beside him on the box at the front of the coach. A young gentleman sitting nearby gave me a big military cloak to keep me warm. He was an officer traveling to York to join his regiment. The rest of my journey was much better than the beginning. The coachman told funny stories, and the officer was very polite and friendly. While we talked, I learned that he knew my Aunt Maria. Because of this, he offered to take me to her house and make sure I was safe after my strange adventure. When we arrived in York, the coach stopped at the inn where Aunt Maria's maid was waiting for me. I didn't mind the officer joining us, and Aunt Maria was very kind. She insisted he stay for the early breakfast she had prepared for me. "Well, Granny, your scary experience didn't end so badly," said one of her listeners. "Not badly at all," Granny replied with a gentle smile. "If I hadn't been so frightened, I would never have met that young officer." "And the officer was?" one of them asked. "He was Captain Martin back then," Granny said. "Later, he became General Martin, and he was your grandfather."